Hey guys, tonight's subject sounds domestic, almost harmless at first glance. A house is supposed to be the place where people escaped the dirt and uncertainty of the outside world. But in medieval Europe, the home was often where many of life's smells became most concentrated, most trapped, and most inescapable. So before we begin, let me know where you're watching from, and tell me which history topic you'd like to hear next. And if you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, a quiet like really does help support the channel. And if you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating stories from the past, subscribing is a simple way to keep them coming. To understand why medieval homes smelled worse than almost anything most people experience today, it helps to begin with a basic fact that modern viewers often underestimate. Bad smells in the medieval world were not usually the result of one dramatic source. They came from layers, from fuel, bodies, animals, dampness, food, waste, illness, and building materials, all pressed together inside enclosed spaces built for survival rather than comfort. And what seems shocking now often made practical sense then, once you understand the limits people were living under. A medieval home was not designed around fresh airflow, sanitation, and separation of functions in the way a modern house is. For much of the population, especially peasants and laborers, the home was a place where cooking, sleeping, eating, washing, storing tools, drying clothes, nursing the sick, and sometimes sheltering animals all happened within a very tight area. Privacy was scarce, specialized rooms were limited, and cleanliness had to compete with hunger, cold, and exhaustion. When survival is difficult, fragrance becomes a luxury. Containment becomes more important than freshness. For many families in Northern and Western Europe, the first smell that would have met you on entering was smoke. Not the faint, pleasant trace of a fireplace after a winter evening, but a heavy, lived-in smoke that clung to rafters, cloth, hair, and skin. In poorer homes, the hearth was the center of domestic life, used constantly for heat and cooking. Chimneys were not always present, especially in simpler dwellings earlier in the medieval period, and even where smoke outlets existed, they were often inefficient. Smoke drifted upward, blackened beams, seeped into thatch, and settled into everything porous. A house could breathe just enough to keep people alive, while still holding on to the smell of burned wood, peat, straw, or charcoal day after day. And the type of fuel mattered. Wood smoke had one quality. Peat had another, denser and earthier. In some places, dried animal dung might also be burned, especially where timber was limited. None of this produced the dry neutrality of modern heating. These fuels left behind not only odor, but residue. Walls absorbed it, clothing absorbed it, bedding absorbed it. If a family had little chance to wash fabrics thoroughly, which was common, the smell did not disappear. It layered itself onto older smells already living in the room. Then there was damp. Medieval houses, especially ordinary ones, were vulnerable to moisture in ways that modern construction tries hard to prevent. Earthen floors could hold wetness. Thatched roofs, though effective in some ways, could harbor rot if not well maintained. Timber frames and wattle and daub walls were practical building methods, but they existed in a climate where rain, mud, and cold were constant companions. Damp wool, damp straw, damp rushes on the floor, damp cloaks hung near the fire. All of these created a stale and organic heaviness. It was not simply the smell of water. It was the smell of wet material that could not fully dry, mixed with soot and the residue of daily use. Floor coverings made matters worse in a way that surprises many people now. In wealthier homes, herbs and rushes might be scattered across floors, sometimes partly for comfort, insulation, or scent. In theory, this sounds almost charming. In practice, unless regularly replaced, such layers trapped crumbs, grease, spit, animal droppings, and whatever else fell underfoot. Over time, they could become less like fresh greenery and more like a slowly decaying mat of organic waste. Even in better-off environments, where people did care about order and household dignity, maintenance had to be constant to prevent the floor itself from becoming a reservoir of stale odor. In poorer homes, where time and resources were thinner, the gap between ideal practice and lived reality could be wide. The human body contributed its own share, though not always in the simplistic way modern myths suggest. Medieval people were not indifferent to filth, and many did wash in the ways available to them. But full-body bathing was irregular for many, laundry was laborious, and soap was not always abundant or cheap. More importantly, people worked hard. They handled animals, earth, ash, fish, leather, wool, and manure. Their clothes were reworn. Their outer garments gathered rain and smoke. Their hands did not pass from sanitized surfaces to sanitized surfaces. So even where there was no neglect, there was accumulation. Sweat mixed with smoke, kitchen grease, stale wool, and the ordinary grime of labor. A person returning home did not bring the outside world in by accident. The outside world had never really been sealed off in the first place. Beds and bedding were another hidden source. A medieval bed, especially for the poor, was rarely the plush, isolated sleeping environment people imagine from costume dramas. Mattresses might be stuffed with straw, feathers if one was fortunate, or other available material. Bedding was expensive, difficult to wash, and vulnerable to fleas, lice, and dampness. Shared sleeping was normal. Bodies warmed the bed, but they also sweated into it. Illness passed through it. Infants slept in the same space. Animals sometimes remained nearby. Even with airing and care, the smell of used bedding could become thick and persistent, especially in winter, when windows stayed shut and warmth mattered more than ventilation. The presence of animals is one of the most important reasons medieval homes could smell so overwhelming to a modern visitor. Not every family kept animals inside, and practices varied by region, status, and season, but the separation between human and animal space was often far less absolute than it is today. Chickens, dogs, goats, and in some cases even larger animals might be sheltered close to or within part of the house, especially during harsh weather. This was not evidence of ignorance. Animals represented wealth, food, labor, and survival. Keeping them close could protect them from theft and cold. But the cost was obvious. Animal breath, manure, wet fur, spoiled feed, and the smell of enclosed livestock entered the domestic environment directly. Once you combine smoke, damp straw, unwashed wool, cooking fat, and animal presence, the atmosphere begins to feel less like a single odor and more like a complete sensory world. And medieval cooking added another layer. Food was prepared over open fire. Meat, fish, onions, leeks, cabbage, pottage, ale, broth, and rendered fat all release smells into the same limited interior space. Without modern extraction, without refrigeration, and without sealed storage, strong food odors lingered. A kitchen smell today can be pleasant because it rises, disperses, and leaves a relatively clean room behind. In a medieval house, cooking odors settled into old smoke, old textiles, and old dampness. Even appetizing food could leave an afterlife in the walls. Preservation methods could be especially powerful. Salted fish, dried meat, aged cheese, fermented ale, souring grain, and stored vegetables all carried strong scents. In a hungry world, these were not unpleasant luxuries to be judged aesthetically. They were necessities. But necessity has its own aroma. A barrel of something edible that had survived the winter did not need to smell elegant. It needed to still be there. The medieval nose, like the medieval stomach, was trained by priorities very different from ours. And then there was waste, which may be the most obvious point, but also one that becomes more interesting the longer you look at it. Medieval households did not possess modern plumbing, sealed sewer systems, disinfectants, or flushing toilets. Chamber pots were common. Household wastewater had to go somewhere. Latrines existed in towns and castles and monasteries in various forms, but ordinary disposal was inconsistent and often local. In crowded urban areas especially, refuse, wastewater, and human waste could accumulate alarmingly close to daily life. Even in rural homes, the management of bodily waste depended on routine labor, access to space, and weather conditions. On cold nights or during illness, people did not move through their homes with modern sanitary convenience. The results remained close. What made the smell worse was not only proximity, but timing. Waste was not always removed instantly. Cloth diapers, sickroom vessels, kitchen scraps, spoiled food, and slops all had to be handled manually. That means the home regularly held material in transition, not yet clean, not yet gone. Modern life hides these transitions with pipes, sealed bins, detergents, and municipal systems. Medieval life made them visible and, more importantly, breathable. Illness deepened everything. A sick household smelled different from a healthy one. Fever, sweat, vomit, infected wounds, medicinal herbs, blood, and stale air created a heavier and more troubling atmosphere. And since homes were the main sites of care for most people, domestic space could shift quickly from ordinary discomfort into something much more intimate and distressing. A room where someone was being treated or watched through the night did not have the clean neutrality of a hospital room. It had all the usual household smells, intensified by suffering and fear. That, too, is part of what people today often miss when imagining the medieval home. It was not just a backdrop to life. It was the container for nearly every stage of life. Even wealthier homes were not free from unpleasant smells. They were better resourced, not magically fresh. Great halls held many bodies, large meals, dogs, rushes, smoke, and waste management systems that still fell short of modern expectations. Perfumes, incense, herbs, and flowers might be used to improve the atmosphere, but the very existence of these practices tells you something important. People were aware of smell. They tried to manage it. Fragrant substances were not used because everything already smelled fine. They were used because the world smelled strong, and sometimes offensively so. That is one of the most useful corrections to the common assumption that medieval people simply did not notice odor. They noticed it very well. Smell had medical, moral, and social meaning. Bad air could be feared as dangerous. Sweet smells could be associated with purity, status, or health. Religious spaces often used incense not only for symbolism, but also because scent transformed atmosphere. Households used herbs for strewing, washing, or hanging in rooms because scent mattered. The issue was not indifference. It was limitation. They lived in conditions where control was partial, expensive, and often temporary. And there was one more irony here. Medieval homes smelled so powerfully not because people lacked senses, but because home itself had to do too much. It was workshop, kitchen, nursery, bedroom, storeroom, shelter, and sometimes barn. Modern life distributes these functions across separate rooms, separate buildings, and separate infrastructures. Medieval life compressed them. The smell of the house was, in a way, the smell of society before compartmentalization, before pipes took waste away, before industrial soap normalized deep cleaning, before ventilation became an expectation, before the private body, the cooking fire, and the stable yard were pushed decisively apart. So when we say that medieval homes smelled worse than almost anything today, what we are really describing is not just filth. It is a dense ecosystem of necessity. The smoke was there because people needed heat. The animals were close because wealth could bleat, cluck, or kick. The dampness remained because houses fought the weather imperfectly. The bedding smelled because labor left little room for constant laundering. The waste lingered because removal required hands, time, and systems that barely existed. None of it was glamorous. Much of it was uncomfortable. But almost all of it had a reason. And once you begin to see the medieval house this way, the smell stops being a colorful detail and becomes something larger. It becomes evidence of how close people lived to fuel, to food, to animals, to weather, and to one another. It reveals a world in which comfort was fragile, cleanliness was relative, and domestic life was far more physical than the tidy visual reconstructions we often inherit. And from there, another question begins to open. If the ordinary home could already hold this much smoke, dampness, labor, and bodily reality, then winter, crowding, and urban growth did not simply make medieval life harder. They changed the very atmosphere people were breathing each day, and that is where the story grows even more revealing. Because winter did not simply add cold to this already dense environment, it quietly sealed it. As temperatures dropped, the medieval household began to change its behavior in small but important ways. Doors stayed shut longer. Openings were blocked against drafts. Windows, where they existed at all, were often small and unglazed or covered with shutters, parchment, or oiled cloth. These measures helped preserve warmth, but they also reduced airflow to a minimum. The house, already full of layered smells, became more enclosed, more inward-facing. What had once drifted out now remained. Inside, the fire burned more continuously. This brought comfort, but also intensified the presence of smoke. In winter, the distinction between warmth and suffocation could become very narrow. A hearth that burned through the evening and into the night filled the air not only with heat, but with soot, ash, and fine particles that settled invisibly on skin, food, and bedding. Over time, even the structure of the house absorbed this constant exposure. Timber darkened, thatch thickened with residue. The interior developed a kind of permanence of smell, not just a temporary condition. Clothing played its part in this enclosure as well. Heavier garments, wool cloaks, layered tunics, fur linings where available, were worn repeatedly and rarely washed during colder months. Washing required water, and water required effort, especially when it froze. Drying cloth indoors added moisture back into the already damp environment. So garments accumulated the odors of smoke, sweat, and daily work, then brought them back into the same enclosed space each evening. When people gathered together for warmth, their clothing did not remain separate from the air. It contributed to it. Sleeping arrangements reflected the same logic of containment. Families and sometimes extended groups slept closer together to share body heat. Curtains might be drawn around beds to trap warmth, creating smaller pockets of air within the room. These enclosed sleeping spaces were effective against the cold, but they also held on to everything else: breath, perspiration, the faint but persistent traces of illness, and the underlying smells already present in bedding and clothing. The night did not cleanse the house, concentrated it. In towns, this seasonal enclosure interacted with something else: density. Medieval urban life brought people into close proximity in ways that could amplify every sensory experience. Houses leaned toward one another across narrow streets. Upper floors sometimes extended outward, reducing light and airflow below. Workshops operated within or adjacent to homes. Tanners, dyers, butchers, and other trades that produced strong odors were part of the same living environment, not isolated from it. And in winter, as activity moved indoors and windows remained closed, the smells of industry, domestic life, and human presence mingled more completely. One detail that often goes unnoticed is how sound and smell work together in these spaces. A modern home separates many of its functions not just physically, but acoustically. Medieval homes did not. The same room might hold conversation, cooking, sleeping, and care for the sick. The same air that carried voices also carried scent. A pot simmering on the fire, a child coughing in the corner, damp boots set near the hearth, and a dog shaking off rainwater. All of these events overlapped. And because they overlapped, their effects did too. The atmosphere of the house became a shared condition, something that could not easily be escaped even for a few hours. It is also worth noticing that cleanliness, where it was pursued, often focused on what could be seen and managed directly. Surfaces might be wiped, floors might be swept, bedding might be aired when weather allowed. Herbs might be used to freshen the room. But much of what created odor lived beyond immediate reach. Smoke embedded itself in materials. Dampness hid in corners and underfoot. Waste lingered in containers awaiting disposal. Animals introduced elements that could not be fully controlled without sacrificing their usefulness. The medieval household was engaged in constant, practical maintenance, but the scale of the problem often exceeded what routine effort could fully resolve. And yet, within these conditions, people developed a sense of normalcy. The human ability to adapt to environment is powerful. What would strike a modern visitor as overwhelming could become, over time, a familiar background. This does not mean that people enjoyed these smells or stopped noticing them entirely. It means that the threshold of what counted as unbearable shifted. A particularly foul odor might still stand out. A rotting carcass, a badly managed latrine, a sick room at its worst, but the baseline was different. Life adjusted itself to the atmosphere it inhabited. This adaptation shaped social perception in subtle ways. Smell could signal status, but not in the simple terms we might expect. Wealthier individuals might have access to cleaner clothing, more frequent laundering, and pleasant scents like oils or herbs. But even they lived within environments that modern standards would find difficult. Cleanliness was relative, not absolute. A person might be considered well-kept in one context and yet still carry traces of smoke or dampness that would seem striking today. The contrast between classes existed, but it operated within a narrower range than we might assume. There is also an important psychological dimension to this. Medieval understandings of health were closely tied to the idea of air, its quality, its movement, and its perceived purity. Bad smells were not just unpleasant. They could be seen as dangerous. The concept of miasma, or harmful air, influenced how people thought about disease and environment. While the scientific basis of these ideas was incomplete, they were not entirely misguided. Stagnant air, poor sanitation, and close quarters do contribute to illness. So the concern with smell carried an undercurrent of caution. People sought fresh air when they could. They used scent as a tool to counter what they feared, even if the mechanisms were not fully understood. This makes certain practices more understandable. The use of fragrant herbs, the opening of spaces when weather allowed, the placement of beds away from obvious sources of foul air. All of these actions reflect an attempt to manage risk as well as comfort. But again, limitation defined the outcome. A household might know that fresh air was beneficial, but winter cold could make ventilation dangerous. A town might recognize the problem of waste, but lack the infrastructure to remove it efficiently. Knowledge and capacity did not always align. And as populations grew, especially in expanding towns and early cities, these tensions became more visible. More people meant more waste, more animals, more fuel consumption, more cooking, more illness, and less space for any of it to disperse. Narrow streets and crowded housing reduced airflow further. Water sources could become contaminated. The difference between a manageable level of domestic odor and a more serious public health problem began to narrow. What had once been a matter of household experience started to connect with broader urban challenges. Within the home itself, small adjustments continued to be made. Some households improved their hearth designs, creating more effective smoke channels. Others separated animal spaces where possible, even if only partially. Floors might be renewed or cleaned more regularly when resources allowed. Wealthier homes experimented with better ventilation and more defined rooms. These changes did not eliminate odor, but they show a gradual movement toward greater control. The medieval house was not static. It evolved, slowly, unevenly, and often in response to discomfort that people clearly recognized. And still, the essential structure of daily life remained the same. The house was the center of everything. It held work, rest, illness, family, and survival all within its walls. It carried the marks of those activities not just visually but sensorially. To live in such a space was to accept a certain closeness, to materials, to other people, to animals, to the byproducts of living that could not be easily separated or hidden away. If anything, what begins to emerge is not just a story about unpleasant smells, but about intimacy with the conditions of existence. Modern life has placed layers of distance between people and many of these realities. We separate waste from living space. We isolate animals. We control temperature and airflow. We clean with substances designed to erase trace and residue. In doing so, we have also reduced our awareness of how much effort it takes to maintain that separation. In the medieval home, that separation was thinner. The boundaries between clean and unclean, fresh and stale, inside and outside, were constantly negotiated. And because they were negotiated rather than fixed, they were also vulnerable. A few days of bad weather, a shortage of fuel, an illness in the household, or a delay in clearing waste could shift the balance quickly. The smell of the house would change, sometimes gradually, sometimes all at once. And this is where the broader environment begins to press more firmly against the domestic one, because the smells of the medieval home were never entirely contained within its walls. They were connected to what lay just beyond the door, in the street, in the yard, in the shared spaces of the community. And as those external conditions grew more crowded and more complex, the line between household air and the wider atmosphere began to blur in ways that would shape everyday life even more deeply. Step outside a medieval home, and the change was not always a relief. In many cases, the outside air did not feel clean or open in the way a modern viewer might expect. Instead, it often carried its own dense mixture of smells, shaped by the rhythms of the street, the trades practiced nearby, and the simple fact that waste and activity were rarely separated by design. The household did not exist in isolation. It breathed in what the surrounding world produced. In smaller rural communities, this connection might be less intense, though never absent. A yard could hold refuse, animal dung, discarded food, and the residue of daily labor. Rain might wash some of it away, but it could also spread it, softening the ground and turning it into a mixture of mud and organic matter that clung to shoes and was tracked back inside. The path from door to hearth was not a clean boundary. It was a continuation of the same material environment, just under a different roof. In towns, the situation became more layered. Streets were not simply passages for movement. They were active working spaces. Butchers processed animals, leaving behind blood, offal, and scraps that could not always be removed immediately. Tanners treated hides with substances that were necessary for preserving leather but notoriously strong in smell. Fishmongers handled their goods in conditions where freshness could not always be guaranteed, especially in warmer seasons. Even ordinary household waste might be emptied into the street or into nearby channels, depending on local customs and regulations. The result was an environment where the air outside could be as saturated as the air within, though in different ways. Instead of the enclosed accumulation of smoke and dampness, the street offered a shifting, sometimes sharper set of odors: raw, exposed, and constantly renewed by activity. But crucially, these two atmospheres did not remain separate. Every time a door opened, every time a person entered or left, every time goods were carried in from the market or waste was taken out, the boundary softened again. This exchange worked in both directions. A household that produced smoke, cooking smells, and waste contributed to the shared environment of the street. At the same time, the street returned its own mixture back into the home. The medieval house was not sealed. It was part of a larger system of air, one that moved slowly, unevenly, and often without deliberate control. Seasonal changes influenced this relationship in ways that were sometimes subtle and sometimes dramatic. In warmer months, increased activity, faster decay, and the presence of insects could intensify outdoor smells. Food spoiled more quickly. Waste decomposed more rapidly. The air carried these changes, especially in crowded areas where removal systems struggled to keep pace. Inside the home, doors might be opened more often for airflow, which provided relief from heat but also invited these external smells to mingle with the already complex interior. Winter, as we have seen, reversed this dynamic in part by sealing spaces, but it did not eliminate the connection. Instead, it created a slower exchange. Waste might accumulate longer before removal. Frozen ground could limit disposal options. The street might appear quieter, but its underlying conditions did not vanish. And when the air did move, when doors opened, when people traveled between spaces, it carried with it the concentrated traces of both environments. One of the more revealing aspects of this shared atmosphere is how it affected perception of place. A modern city might have distinct zones: residential, commercial, industrial. Medieval towns were less clearly divided. A home might sit next to a workshop, which might sit next to a market stall, which might sit next to a space used for animals or storage. Smell, in this context, became one of the ways people understood where they were. It signaled activity, trade, and function. It could also signal danger, neglect, or disease. This sensory map was not static. It changed with the time of day. Early morning might bring the smell of baking bread or fresh-cut meat. Midday might carry the heat of cooking fires and the press of human activity. Evening might mix the closing of stalls with the accumulation of waste and the return of people to their homes. Night, especially in enclosed spaces, might feel heavier, quieter, but no less full. And within this shifting environment, certain places stood out more sharply than others. Areas near latrines, waste pits, or stagnant water could become focal points of unpleasant smell. So too could locations associated with particular trades. These were not simply inconveniences. They shaped patterns of movement and habitation. People might avoid certain paths when possible, or adjust their routines based on what they expected to encounter. In this way, smell influenced behavior, even when it could not be fully controlled. There is also a social dimension to this shared environment that becomes clearer the longer you consider it. If smell could not be entirely avoided, it could still be interpreted. People made judgments, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly, about what different smells meant. A well-kept household might still carry the marks of its environment, but there were degrees of care, degrees of attention, and degrees of success in managing what could be managed. These differences could signal something about a person's resources, their habits, or their standing within the community. At the same time, the limits were widely understood. No one could completely remove themselves from the shared conditions of the town. Even the wealthier households, with better materials and more space, still lived within the same broader atmosphere. Their walls might be thicker, their rooms more numerous, their practices more refined, but the air itself was not entirely theirs to control. It moved beyond property lines, beyond social distinctions, carrying with it the collective reality of the place. This shared atmosphere also helps explain why certain efforts at regulation began to appear over time. As towns grew and conditions intensified, authorities sometimes attempted to control where certain activities took place or how waste was managed. These efforts were not always consistent or successful, but they reflect an awareness that the environment had become something that affected everyone, not just individual households. The smell of a street was not a private matter. It was a public condition. Even so, enforcement was difficult. Resources were limited, and daily survival often took precedence over long-term improvements. A butcher needed to process meat when it was available. A household needed to dispose of waste when it could. A tanner needed to treat hides in ways that were effective, even if unpleasant. The tension between necessity and comfort remained constant. And in the middle of this, ordinary life continued. Children grew up within these environments, learning to navigate them as naturally as they learned to speak or work. Visitors might notice the intensity of the smells more sharply, just as a modern person entering a very different environment today might feel overwhelmed at first. But for those who lived within it, the experience was more continuous, more integrated into the fabric of daily life. What begins to emerge, then, is not simply a contrast between past and present, but a different relationship to the material world. Medieval people lived closer to the processes that sustained them, closer to food in its raw and preserved forms, closer to animals, closer to fuel, closer to waste, and closer to the limitations of their surroundings. The smells that resulted were not incidental. They were part of that closeness. And yet, even within this closeness, there were moments of contrast that could feel almost surprising. A sudden breeze through an open door, a freshly cleaned space after effort and time, the scent of herbs laid down on the floor, the brief clarity of air after rain. These moments did not erase the broader conditions, but they would have stood out precisely because they were different. They offered a sense of relief, however temporary, and perhaps a reminder of what a more controlled environment might feel like. It is in these small contrasts that you begin to see the seeds of change. Not immediate transformation, but gradual shifts in expectation and practice. As techniques improved, as materials became more available, as towns adapted to their own growth, people continued to experiment with ways of managing their environment more effectively. Some of these changes were small adjustments in building, in cleaning, in organization. Others would take much longer to develop. But even before those larger transformations took hold, the medieval home and its surrounding environment had already shaped a very particular kind of daily awareness. People knew what their world smelled like, in all its variations. They understood, often without needing to articulate it, how those smells connected to work, to health, to weather, and to community. And as towns expanded further, drawing more people, more trade, and more complexity into their boundaries, that shared atmosphere did not simply persist. It intensified, evolving into something that would increasingly demand attention, not just from individual households, but from entire communities trying to live with an air that was no longer entirely their own. Growing towns, this pressure slowly pushed people toward more deliberate habits, not out of comfort but out of necessity. What had once been managed informally within the household began to take on a more organized rhythm. Waste, for example, could no longer simply linger indefinitely near where people lived and worked. In some places, designated areas for disposal began to appear more clearly, even if they were imperfect. Cesspits were dug, sometimes lined, sometimes not, and periodically emptied by laborers whose work was essential but deeply unpleasant. These men, often working at night, moved through the town performing a task that most others preferred not to think about. Their presence was part of an emerging system, a quiet acknowledgement that the air people breathed was becoming a shared responsibility. But even here, the solution was incomplete. Emptying a pit did not eliminate smell. It relocated it. What left one neighborhood had to be taken somewhere else, often just beyond the immediate boundary of daily life, where it could still influence the environment in less visible ways. Water complicated everything further. In theory, flowing water could carry waste away, dilute it, and reduce its presence. In practice, medieval towns often relied on rivers, streams, or shallow wells that were also used for drinking, washing, and cooking. When waste entered these systems, whether by accident or design, it did not simply disappear. It altered the character of the water itself. A stream that passed through a town might carry with it the residue of countless households, trades, and animals, blending them into a moving current that connected one part of the community to another. This meant that the boundary between clean and unclean was not only difficult to maintain, it was constantly shifting. Water drawn in one place might be clearer than water drawn in another. A well that seemed safe could become compromised over time. And since the senses available to people were limited, sight, taste, and smell among them, these cues became important, even if they were not always reliable. A foul smell in water might signal danger, but the absence of a strong smell did not guarantee safety. Back inside the home, these external pressures were felt in quieter ways. Households became more attentive to where certain activities took place, even if space was limited. Food preparation might be kept as separate as possible from waste storage. Sleeping areas might be arranged to avoid direct exposure to drafts carrying unpleasant air from outside. Windows, when opened, were not simply for light or temperature, but for moments of exchange with the outside atmosphere, chosen carefully based on time of day and conditions. There is an almost careful choreography to this. A door opens, not just for movement, but to let out accumulated smoke. A window is unlatched briefly, then closed again before the cold or the street air becomes too intrusive. Bedding is carried outside when weather allows, shaken and aired in an attempt to restore some freshness before being returned to its place. These small actions do not transform the environment entirely, but they show an ongoing effort to negotiate with it. And still, the structure of the house itself imposed limits. Materials like wood, thatch, and earth were practical and widely available, but they were also porous. They absorbed, they held on to moisture and smell in ways that could not easily be reversed. Even when a space was cleaned, even when fresh air passed through it, the memory of what had been there before remained embedded in the surfaces. A newly prepared meal might momentarily dominate the air, but beneath it, older layers persisted. This layering effect becomes especially noticeable over time. A house that has been lived in for years, or even generations, carries with it a kind of accumulated atmosphere. It reflects not just a single moment, but a history of use. Fires lit, food cooked, animals sheltered, illnesses endured, winters survived. All of these leave traces. In modern terms, we might think of this as wear or aging. In sensory terms, it is something more immediate. It is a continuity of smell that links present experience to past activity. For the people living within these spaces, this continuity could be both familiar and, at times, oppressive. Familiar because it formed part of daily life, something expected and understood. Oppressive because it was difficult to escape. Even stepping outside did not always provide relief, as the shared atmosphere of the town often mirrored or amplified what was inside. And this is where a quieter kind of awareness begins to emerge. Not a dramatic realization, but a gradual recognition that the environment itself could influence health and well-being in ways that were not entirely within individual control. Illness did not spread randomly. It appeared in patterns, often in places where air felt heavy, where water seemed compromised, where waste accumulated. People may not have understood the mechanisms in modern scientific terms, but they could observe the associations. These observations did not immediately lead to effective solutions, but they did shape behavior. In times of sickness, People might attempt to improve the air within a home by opening spaces more frequently, burning certain materials, or introducing stronger scents. They might avoid particular areas of a town known for their unpleasant conditions. They might change routines, however slightly, in response to what they sensed around them. There is also a tension here between acceptance and resistance. On one hand, much of the environment had to be accepted. It was the product of necessity, of available resources, of the way life was organized. On the other hand, there was a clear desire, expressed in small actions and gradual changes, to make things better, to reduce discomfort, to create moments of relief where possible. Over time, these small adjustments began to accumulate. In some towns, regulations became more defined, attempting to control where waste could be disposed of or how certain trades operated. In some homes, building techniques improved, allowing for slightly better ventilation or separation of spaces. In some communities, shared practices developed that made the environment more manageable, even if only at the margins. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of this process is how slowly it unfolded. There was no single moment when medieval homes suddenly became clean or odorless. There was no clear boundary between a world of heavy, unavoidable smells and a world of controlled, sanitized air. Instead, there was a long period of overlap where older practices continued alongside newer attempts at improvement, where success was partial and often temporary. And within that overlap, daily life continued to be shaped by the same fundamental reality, that the home, the street, and the wider environment were deeply interconnected. What happened in one space affected the others. What was produced inside the house did not remain there. What existed outside could not be kept entirely at bay. So when someone closed their door at the end of the day, seeking rest or shelter, they were not sealing themselves off from the world in the way we might imagine. They were simply shifting their position within it, moving from one concentration of smells, materials, and activities to another. The house did not isolate. It contained, temporarily, a portion of a much larger system. And as populations continued to grow, as trade expanded, and as towns became more complex, that system did not become easier to manage. It became denser, more demanding, and in many ways more noticeable, pressing further into daily awareness and quietly setting the stage for changes that would take shape over the centuries that followed. One of the earliest shifts was not about eliminating smell, but about controlling its direction. As building techniques slowly evolved, particularly in wealthier households and more established towns, there was increasing attention given to how air moved through a space. Chimneys, which had once been rare or rudimentary in simpler dwellings, became more defined architectural features. Instead of allowing smoke to gather and drift through the room, it could be guided upward and out, even if imperfectly. This did not create a clean environment by modern standards. Smoke still escaped, soot still settled, and the smell of burning fuel remained constant. But there was a subtle difference. The air inside the room began, at times, to feel slightly less saturated, slightly more breathable. And that difference, even when small, would have been noticeable to those who experienced it daily. With chimneys came another change that is easy to overlook. The hearth itself, once the absolute center of the room, began to lose a little of its dominance. Cooking, heating, and living could still revolve around it, but the idea that fire and smoke could be partially contained opened the possibility, however limited, of organizing space differently. Rooms could begin to take on more specific roles, even if only in larger homes. And when functions are separated, even slightly, smells begin to separate with them. At the same time, materials themselves began to shift in subtle ways. Floors that were once simple earth or loosely covered with rushes might, in some households, be replaced or supplemented with wood or stone. These surfaces were not sterile, but they were easier to clean, easier to sweep, and less likely to hold moisture in the same way as packed dirt. A floor that could be scrubbed, even occasionally, changed the rhythm of maintenance and the persistence of certain odors. Walls, too, could be treated. Lime washing, for example, became a more common practice in certain regions and contexts. It brightened interiors, but it also had practical effects. It could reduce dampness, discourage pests, and create a surface that felt cleaner, even if it did not remove all underlying smells. The act of refreshing a wall, of covering over what had accumulated, was not only visual. It was part of a broader effort to manage the sensory environment of the home. These changes did not occur everywhere at once, nor did they transform the experience overnight. For many people, especially those with limited means, the older conditions persisted. Smoke still filled rooms. Floors still held dampness. Animals still shared space. But what matters here is the direction of movement. Even within a largely unchanged world, small improvements began to alter expectations. And expectation is a quiet but powerful force. Once people experience a slightly cleaner, slightly less oppressive environment, even briefly, it becomes something they can recognize, something they can compare against. A house that vents smoke more effectively feels different from one that does not. A floor that can be swept clean of debris offers a different kind of daily experience than one that constantly absorbs it. This growing awareness did not eliminate the realities of medieval life, but it began to shape choices where choices were available. In towns, for instance, wealthier households might invest more in construction that improved airflow or separated living spaces. Workshops that produced particularly strong odors might be positioned slightly further from the most desirable living areas, not out of regulation alone, but out of preference where possible. And still, the shared atmosphere of the town remained a limiting factor. No matter how well a single house was constructed, it existed within a broader environment that continued to produce and circulate smell. The street, the market, the nearby river, the surrounding workshops. All of these continued to influence what entered the home. This creates an interesting contrast between control and exposure. Inside the house, people could make small, deliberate adjustments. Outside, they were part of a collective system that was much harder to shape. And because air moved between these spaces, the effectiveness of any one improvement was always partial. There is also a more subtle shift happening at the level of habit. As people began to think more deliberately about their environment, certain routines gained importance. Regular sweeping, airing of bedding, and careful placement of waste became not just practical necessities, but expected parts of maintaining a household. These routines did not eliminate odor, but they helped manage it, preventing it from becoming overwhelming in the same way. At the same time, the use of scent as a counterbalance became more intentional. Herbs, flowers, and aromatic substances were not new, but their role became more clearly connected to the idea of improving the atmosphere of the home. Hanging bundles of plants, strewing fresh materials on the floor, or burning certain substances could change the immediate experience of a space, even if only temporarily. It is important to recognize that this was not simply about masking unpleasant smells. It was about creating moments of contrast, brief intervals where the air felt lighter, where the environment felt more controlled. In a world where complete cleanliness was out of reach, these moments had their own value. And yet, even as these adjustments took hold, the deeper structure of medieval life continued to resist full transformation. The home remained a place where many functions overlapped. The boundaries between activities were still fluid. The same room might still hold cooking, sleeping, and storage. Animals might still be nearby. Waste still required manual handling. Water sources remained vulnerable. This tension between gradual improvement and persistent limitation is what gives the medieval home its particular character. It was not static, but it was also not easily changed. It moved slowly, shaped by necessity, by available resources, and by the accumulation of small, practical insights rather than sweeping reform. Perhaps one of the most telling signs of this gradual shift is how people began to think about space itself. Over time, there was a growing sense that certain activities belonged in certain places, that separating them could improve both comfort and health. This idea, which feels obvious now, was not always easy to implement in a world where space was limited and multifunctional by design. But even a slight separation, keeping animals in a distinct area, placing waste further from the main living space, arranging sleeping areas away from the most active parts of the house, could change how smells moved and settled. These were not dramatic architectural innovations. They were incremental adjustments, often shaped by experience rather than theory. And as these adjustments accumulated, they began to influence not just individual homes, but the broader layout of towns and communities. Streets might be organized with a greater awareness of where certain trades were located. Shared spaces might be managed with a bit more attention to their impact on surrounding homes. Again, these changes were uneven and often incomplete, but they reflect a growing recognition that environment could be shaped, even if only gradually. Still, for most people, the daily experience of smell remained a constant presence. It was something to be managed, endured, and occasionally improved, but rarely eliminated. The medieval home did not become fresh in the modern sense. It became, in some cases, slightly more controlled, slightly more responsive to the needs of its inhabitants. And within that slow movement toward control, something else begins to emerge. A shift not just in how people managed their environment, but in how they imagined what a home could be. Not merely a place of shelter and survival, but a space that, even within its limits, could be shaped, adjusted, and gradually improved. And as this idea took hold, even in its earliest and most tentative forms, it began to influence the next stage of change, one that would extend beyond individual households and into the ways entire communities started to rethink the relationship between living space, waste, and the air that connected them all. One of the clearest signs of this shift appeared in how towns began to treat their streets, not simply as shared pathways, but as spaces that required a degree of maintenance. In earlier periods, what accumulated in the street was often left to settle, dry, or be gradually worn down by movement and weather. But as populations increased and the consequences of neglect became harder to ignore, there was a growing sense that the street itself needed to be managed. This did not mean cleanliness in the modern sense. Streets remained muddy, uneven, and filled with the traces of daily life. But in some towns, efforts were made to clear particularly offensive accumulations, to remove waste at intervals, or to establish expectations, sometimes informal, sometimes enforced, about where certain materials should be discarded. These efforts were inconsistent and often depended on local conditions, but they represent a subtle change in thinking. The air of the street was no longer entirely incidental. It was something that could be influenced, even if only in limited ways. This awareness extended in small but meaningful ways to the placement of structures themselves. Latrines, for example, began to be positioned with slightly more attention to airflow and proximity, especially in larger or more organized settlements. In castles and monasteries, more deliberate systems emerged, sometimes channeling waste away from living areas, using gravity and basic engineering to reduce its immediate presence. These systems were far from perfect, but they show an increasing willingness to think about how materials move through space and how that movement affected the experience of those living nearby. Monastic communities, in particular, offer an interesting glimpse into this evolving awareness. Within their enclosed environments, where discipline and routine were emphasized, there was often greater attention paid to order, cleanliness, and the management of shared space. Latrines might be arranged over running water. Waste disposal could be more regular. Living areas were organized according to function, with sleeping, eating, and working spaces more clearly defined than in many ordinary homes. This did not create a scentless environment, but it did produce a different kind of atmosphere, one where the accumulation of smell was somewhat more controlled, somewhat more predictable. And because monastic life was observed, recorded, and sometimes admired, these practices did not remain entirely isolated. They contributed slowly to broader ideas about how space could be organized. In urban households, especially among those with greater means, similar principles began to take shape, though often in less formal ways. The idea that certain smells belonged in certain places gained quiet acceptance. Kitchens, for example, might be positioned to allow smoke and cooking odors to escape more easily, rather than filling the main living space. Storage areas for food or waste might be placed further from where people slept. Even small adjustments in layout could alter how smells moved and settled within a house. At the same time, the relationship between indoor and outdoor space remained deeply intertwined. Courtyards, yards, and small open areas within or behind houses served as transitional spaces, places where materials could be processed, aired, or temporarily held. These spaces did not eliminate smell, but they redistributed it, allowing some of the more intense aspects of domestic life to occur outside the most enclosed parts of the home. This redistribution had a noticeable effect. A household that could move certain activities outdoors, even partially, experienced a different internal atmosphere than one that could not. But again, this depended on resources, space, and location. In crowded towns, such options were limited. In rural areas, they were more accessible, though still shaped by weather and season. There is also an important distinction to be made between intentional change and incidental improvement. Not every shift in the medieval environment came from a deliberate effort to reduce smell. Some changes were driven by other needs, efficiency, safety, or economic practicality, but had the side effect of altering the sensory experience of the home. For example, improvements in storage methods could reduce spoilage, which in turn reduced certain odors. Better construction techniques might limit dampness, even if the primary goal was structural stability. The gradual refinement of tools and materials affected daily life in ways that were not always immediately obvious, but became clear over time. And yet, despite these incremental changes, there remained a persistent gap between what people could imagine and what they could achieve. The idea of a consistently fresh, clean-smelling home, one where unpleasant odors were rare or quickly eliminated, was still far beyond reach for most. Even the best-managed environments were subject to the same fundamental constraints. The need to cook with open fire, the presence of animals, the limitations of water supply, and the realities of waste disposal. This gap is important because it highlights the nature of medieval improvement. It was not a leap from one condition to another. It was a gradual narrowing of discomfort, a series of small gains that made life slightly more manageable, slightly more predictable, but never entirely free from the pressures that created those conditions in the first place. And within this gradual process, people continued to develop a more refined awareness of their environment. They learned, often through experience, which practices made a difference and which did not. They recognized that certain arrangements led to more tolerable living conditions. They adjusted their routines accordingly, even if the adjustments were modest. This learning was not uniform. It varied from place to place, from household to household, shaped by local knowledge, available resources, and individual priorities. But over time, these scattered insights contributed to a broader pattern, a slow, uneven movement toward greater control over the domestic environment. It is also worth noting that not all smells were treated equally. Some were tolerated, even accepted as part of daily life, while others were actively avoided or mitigated. The smell of smoke, for example, might be unpleasant but was also associated with warmth and cooking. The smell of animals could be linked to wealth and sustenance. But the smell of decay, of stagnant waste, or of illness carried a different weight, one that prompted more immediate attention when possible. This distinction influenced how effort was directed. Resources, limited as they were more likely to be spent addressing what was perceived as most harmful or most disruptive. This does not mean that success was guaranteed, but it does show that medieval people made judgments about their environment that went beyond simple acceptance. And as these judgments became more consistent, they began to influence not just individual behavior, but collective expectations. A street that was regularly cleared, even imperfectly, set a different standard than one that was not. A household that maintained a certain level of order became a reference point, however modest, for others. These differences did not transform the overall condition of medieval life, but they created variation within it. Pockets where the air felt slightly more manageable, slightly less oppressive. At the same time, the underlying system continued to assert itself. Growth brought new pressures. Trade increased the movement of goods, people, and animals. Urban density intensified, and with each of these changes, the balance between control and exposure shifted again, often in ways that made the environment more challenging rather than less. So even as communities began to rethink their relationship with space, waste, and air, they found themselves facing a reality that was constantly evolving. Improvements in one area could be offset by new difficulties in another. A cleaner street might still be bordered by crowded houses. A better ventilated home might still draw in air from a nearby workshop or market. This dynamic of progress and pressure moving together meant that the experience of smell in the medieval world was never static. It changed over time, not in a straight line toward improvement, but through a series of adjustments, responses, and unintended consequences. And as these changes continued to unfold, they began to shape something deeper than daily habit. They started to influence how people thought about responsibility, about who was accountable for the condition of the air, the cleanliness of the street, the management of waste. What had once been primarily a household concern was slowly becoming a shared problem, one that extended beyond the walls of any single home and into the structure of the community itself. And it is in that shift, from private management to shared responsibility, that the next phase of this story begins to take form, as towns and their inhabitants grappled more directly with the question of how to live together in spaces where the air itself could no longer be taken for granted. What had once been tolerated as an unavoidable part of daily life was, in certain places, increasingly seen as something that could, and perhaps should, be limited. Not eliminated, not fully controlled, but reduced, managed, and directed in ways that made communal living more bearable. This shift did not arrive as a single reform or decree. It appeared gradually, often in response to moments when conditions became too difficult to ignore. At times, these moments were seasonal. A particularly warm summer could accelerate decay, turning ordinary waste into something far more intrusive. Smells that might have lingered quietly in cooler weather became sharper, more immediate, more difficult to overlook. In narrow streets, where air moved slowly and people lived in close proximity, the effect could be especially noticeable. Complaints might rise. Temporary measures might be taken. And in some cases, these responses would leave behind small but lasting changes in how space was managed. In other cases, the pressure came from the accumulation of everyday inconvenience. A street that was consistently difficult to pass through, a water source that became unpleasant or unreliable, a neighborhood where the air felt persistently heavy. These were not dramatic crises, but they created a steady awareness that something was not working as well as it might. Over time, this awareness translated into expectation. Not a demand for perfection, but a recognition that conditions could, at least in part, be improved. This is where local authority began to play a more visible role. Town councils, guilds, and other forms of communal organization sometimes stepped in to define basic rules about cleanliness and order. These rules might address where waste could be disposed of, how often certain areas should be cleared, or how particular trades were to be conducted within shared spaces. Enforcement was uneven, and compliance varied, but the existence of such rules reflects an important change. The management of smell and environment was no longer purely a private concern. It had become, in some measure, a matter of public interest. Even then, the solutions remained closely tied to the realities of the time. There were no hidden systems carrying waste far from sight, no sealed containers, no chemical treatments to neutralize odor at its source. Everything still depended on labor, on people moving materials, cleaning spaces, adjusting practices, and because of this, the results were always temporary. A street might be cleared only to accumulate again. A cesspit might be emptied, only to begin filling once more. This cycle of effort and return shaped the rhythm of medieval urban life. Cleanliness, such as it was, became a process rather than a state. It required repetition, attention, and coordination, all of which were limited by time, resources, and competing needs. But even within this cycle, there was progress, however modest. The very act of repeating these efforts reinforced the idea that conditions could be influenced, that the environment was not entirely fixed. Within the home, these broader changes were felt in ways that were sometimes indirect. A street that was cleared more regularly meant that less debris was carried inside. A nearby waste area that was managed more carefully reduced the intensity of external smells entering the house. These improvements did not transform the interior environment, but they altered it at the margins, making daily life slightly more manageable. At the same time, the increasing complexity of towns introduced new challenges. As trade expanded, so did the range of materials moving through urban spaces. Imported goods, preserved foods, raw materials for craft and industry, all brought their own scents, some pleasant, some not. A market could be a place of rich sensory experience, filled with spices, baked goods, fresh produce, and textiles. But it could also be a place where waste accumulated quickly, where spoiled goods contributed to the atmosphere, and where the boundary between desirable and unpleasant smells was constantly shifting. This mixture created a kind of sensory layering that was difficult to disentangle. A street might carry, in a single moment, the smell of bread baking, leather being treated, fish beginning to turn, and waste waiting to be removed. For those who lived there, this was not a sequence but a blend. And because it was a blend, it shaped perception in complex ways. Not every strong smell was negative. Not every unpleasant one could be avoided. The environment became something to be interpreted as much as experienced. There is a certain irony here. As people became more aware of smell and more interested in managing it, they also became more attuned to its presence. What had once been background could become foreground. Improvements made certain contrasts sharper. A slightly cleaner street made a neglected one more noticeable. A well-ventilated room made a stagnant one feel heavier by comparison. This sharpening of perception may have contributed to the gradual spread of better practices. When differences become more visible or more precisely more noticeable through the senses, they can influence behavior more strongly. A household that experienced even a small improvement might be more inclined to maintain it. A community that saw the benefits of regular clearing might be more willing to continue the effort, even if imperfectly. And yet, the underlying constraints remained. Population growth continued to press against available space. Economic activity continued to generate waste. Climate and weather continued to influence how materials behaved. The medieval environment was not easily reshaped, and every improvement existed within a system that could, at any time, push back. This tension between intention and limitation is perhaps most visible in how people responded to moments when the environment seemed to turn against them more dramatically. Periods of illness, for example, often intensified concerns about air and cleanliness. When disease appeared, especially in concentrated areas, the connection between environment and health became harder to ignore, even if the precise causes were not understood. In such moments, efforts to improve the air, opening spaces, burning substances, relocating activities, could become more urgent. These actions were guided by a mix of observation, belief, and necessity. They did not always succeed, but they reinforced the idea that the environment mattered, that the air people shared was not neutral. And this idea, once established, had a way of persisting beyond the immediate crisis. It fed back into everyday practices, into the gradual adjustments people made in their homes and communities. It encouraged a kind of attentiveness, a willingness to notice and respond, even in small ways. Over time, this attentiveness began to influence how spaces were imagined and organized. The notion that air could be directed, that waste could be managed more systematically, that certain activities could be separated for the sake of comfort or health. These ideas did not transform medieval life overnight, but they laid the groundwork for more substantial changes in the future. For now, however, the medieval home remained what it had always been at its core, a place where life's essential activities converged, where the boundaries between clean and unclean were constantly negotiated, and where the air itself carried the marks of everything that happened within and around it. And as towns continued to grow, drawing in more people, more goods, and more complexity, that negotiation did not become easier. It became more intricate, more demanding, and in some ways more visible, as the shared environment of the community pressed ever more closely against the private space of the home, shaping the experience of daily life in ways that could no longer be overlooked. Because once you begin to notice something consistently, once the air feels heavy in certain places, or relief feels noticeable in others, it becomes harder to return to complete indifference. Even if conditions could not be fully changed, they could be compared. And comparison, even in small moments, has a way of guiding behavior over time. This is where a more subtle shift begins to take hold, not in laws or structures, but in preference. People started to favor certain spaces, certain arrangements, certain times of day, based not only on practicality, but on how those environments felt to live in. A room that allowed smoke to escape more easily might become the preferred place to sit. A sleeping space that stayed slightly drier might be chosen over another, even if both were equally functional. These choices were rarely dramatic. They were quiet adjustments, often made without conscious reflection. But as they accumulated, they began to shape how homes were used, even when their structure remained largely unchanged. Within this gradual shift, one of the most interesting developments is the growing importance of timing. Medieval life was already deeply tied to cycles of daylight, of season, of work. But as awareness of the environment increased, timing also became a way of managing air and smell. Doors might be opened at specific moments, when the outside air felt less oppressive. Bedding might be aired during brief periods of dryness between rains. Waste might be removed when conditions made it less intrusive. Even cooking could be timed in ways that minimized discomfort when possible. None of these actions eliminated the underlying issues, but they allowed people to work with their environment rather than simply endure it. This approach reflects something important about medieval life. Control was rarely absolute, but adaptation could be precise. People learned to navigate conditions that could not be fully altered by adjusting their behavior within those limits. At the same time, these adaptations revealed something else: the extent to which medieval homes were part of a living system rather than a fixed space. The air inside was not static. It changed throughout the day, responding to fire, activity, weather, and movement. A house in the early morning might feel different from the same house at midday or late evening. The smell of cooking might dominate for a time, only to fade into the background of smoke and dampness. A brief breeze could alter the atmosphere entirely, if only for a few minutes. This fluidity meant that the experience of smell was not constant, even within the same space. It rose and fell, shifted and blended depending on what was happening and when. And because of this, People experienced their homes not as single, unchanging environments, but as sequences of conditions, each with its own character. There is a kind of attentiveness required to live in such a space. Not the intense focus of a problem to be solved, but a steady awareness of how things feel, how they change, and how small actions can influence those changes. This attentiveness is rarely emphasized in modern depictions of medieval life, but it would have been an ordinary part of daily experience. And within that attentiveness, there is also a kind of acceptance, not passive but practical. People understood that certain conditions were part of their world, just as they understood the limits of what could be done about them. The goal was not perfection, but balance. To keep the house livable, to prevent it from becoming overwhelming, to create moments of comfort within a broader environment that was often difficult. This balance could be delicate. A few missed routines, a stretch of bad weather, an illness in the household. Any of these could disrupt it. Smells that had been managed might return more strongly. Air that had felt tolerable might become heavy again. The house, in this sense, required constant attention, not unlike a tool that needed regular care to remain useful. And yet, even within these constraints, there were differences that mattered. A household that maintained certain practices consistently might experience a noticeably different environment from one that did not. A town that enforced basic cleanliness more regularly might feel different from one that allowed accumulation to persist. These differences did not erase the broader conditions of medieval life, but they created variation within it. Over time, this variation began to influence expectations more broadly. What had once been considered acceptable might come to be seen as avoidable, at least in part. Practices that had been occasional might become more regular. Improvements that had been limited to certain households might spread slowly to others. This is not a story of rapid change, but of gradual adjustment. The medieval home did not suddenly become fresh or clean in a modern sense, but it did, in some contexts, become slightly more responsive to the needs of those living within it. And as that responsiveness increased, even modestly, it began to change how people related to their environment. The house was no longer just something to endure. It became something that could be shaped, within limits, through attention, routine, and small improvements. At the same time, the broader forces shaping medieval life continued to evolve. Trade routes expanded. Towns grew denser. New materials and techniques became available, though unevenly. Each of these developments brought both opportunities and challenges, altering the balance between control and exposure in ways that were not always predictable. In some cases, increased trade introduced materials that improved daily life, better tools, new forms of storage, or goods that made certain tasks easier. In others, it brought new sources of smell, new forms of waste, and new pressures on already crowded environments. The system remained dynamic, constantly adjusting to changes that were often driven by factors far beyond any individual household. And within this shifting landscape, the medieval home continued to serve as the central point of experience, the place where all these influences converged. It remained a space of necessity, of work, of rest, and of adaptation. Its smells, layered and persistent, were not simply byproducts. They were part of the lived reality of a world where the boundaries between inside and outside, between clean and unclean, between comfort and discomfort, were always in motion. And as these boundaries continued to shift, shaped by both gradual improvement and increasing complexity, they began to reveal something deeper. Not just about medieval homes, but about how entire communities were learning, slowly and unevenly, to live within environments that demanded constant negotiation, and that would soon face pressures far greater than anything they had yet encountered. Because as populations continued to rise and towns drew in more people, the delicate balance that households had been managing began to strain in new ways. What had once been a manageable level of shared atmosphere, dense, certainly, but familiar, started to thicken. Not suddenly, not in a way that would have been obvious on any single day, but steadily enough that over time, the difference could be felt. A street that once carried a mixture of everyday smells might begin to feel more persistent, less easily cleared by weather or movement. A courtyard that once allowed some release of household waste might begin to fill more quickly than it could be emptied. Even the rhythms of cleaning and disposal, already tied to labor and time, could begin to lag behind the increasing demands placed upon them. Inside the home, this pressure appeared in quieter ways. The same routines, sweeping, airing, clearing, had to work harder to achieve the same effect. A room that might once have felt tolerable after a brief opening of the door or window could now hold onto its heaviness longer. The air did not move as freely as before, not because the house had changed, but because the environment beyond it had grown denser. And this density was not just physical. It was social, economic, and environmental all at once. More people meant more cooking fires, more animals, more waste, more goods moving through the same limited space. Each household contributed its share, and in doing so, each also experienced the combined effect of everyone else's activity. There is a kind of quiet irony in this. The very growth that made towns more vibrant, more connected, and more economically active also made them more difficult to live in at the most basic sensory level. Prosperity, in its early forms, did not bring immediate comfort. It brought complexity, and with it, new challenges that had to be managed without the benefit of modern systems. One of the clearest examples of this can be seen in how water was used and reused. As towns grew, the demand on wells, streams, and rivers increased. Water that had once served a smaller community now had to support many more people, along with their animals and trades. The same sources were used for drinking, washing, cooking, and waste disposal, often without clear separation. Over time, this overlapping use began to affect not only the quality of the water, but also the air around it. Stagnant pools, slow-moving channels, and overused wells could develop their own distinct odors, which in turn influenced the surrounding environment. A household drawing water from such a source did not simply bring back liquid. It brought back a part of the wider atmosphere, one that would then become part of the domestic space. This connection between water and air is easy to overlook, but in the medieval world, it was deeply felt. A foul-smelling stream was not just an inconvenience. It was a sign that something in the environment had shifted, that the balance between use and renewal had been disrupted. And because water was so central to daily life, this disruption had a way of spreading, touching many aspects of household routine. At the same time, the increasing presence of trade introduced new kinds of materials into these already complex environments. Goods arrived from distant regions, bringing with them unfamiliar scents, spices, oils, preserved foods, textiles treated in different ways. Some of these were welcomed, even prized. They added variety, richness, and, at times, a sense of refinement. But they also added another layer to the sensory experience of the home. A kitchen might now hold not only the familiar smells of local ingredients, but also the sharper, more concentrated aromas of imported goods. Storage spaces might contain materials that behaved differently, that aged differently, that interacted with the existing environment in unexpected ways. This layering of the familiar and the new created a more varied, but also more complicated atmosphere. It required adjustment not only in how things were stored and used, but in how they were perceived. A strong smell might no longer be simply unpleasant. It might be valuable, desirable, or even a sign of status. At the same time, it still had to coexist with the more persistent, less desirable smells of everyday life. And within all of this, the medieval household continued its careful negotiation between what could be controlled and what could not. People adjusted where they could, responded where they must, and endured what remained. But there is a point at which gradual pressure begins to produce more noticeable effects, not just in daily discomfort, but in broader patterns. When the environment becomes consistently heavy, when the air in certain places feels persistently difficult, when illness appears with greater frequency in crowded areas, these are not isolated experiences. They begin to form connections, even if those connections are not fully understood. It is in this context that attention to air, to smell, and to environment becomes more than a matter of comfort. It becomes a matter of concern, of observation, of tentative reasoning about cause and effect. Why does illness appear more often in certain places? Why do some streets feel worse than others? Why does the air change after certain activities or at certain times? These questions did not always lead to accurate answers, but they did encourage a closer engagement with the environment. People watched, noticed, compared. They developed a kind of practical knowledge, built from experience, that guided their responses even when the underlying mechanisms remained unclear. And this growing awareness began to influence decisions in ways that extended beyond the household. Where to build, where to avoid, how to arrange space, how to manage shared areas, these choices, once driven primarily by necessity and opportunity, now carried an additional layer of consideration. The air itself had become part of the equation. Still, it would be a mistake to imagine this as a sudden shift toward modern thinking. The medieval world remained grounded in its own frameworks of understanding, its own limitations, its own priorities. But within those frameworks, something was changing. The environment was no longer simply accepted as it was. It was being observed, questioned, and, in small ways, reshaped. And as this process continued, it began to reveal a deeper truth about medieval homes and the world around them. The smells that filled these spaces were not just the result of neglect or ignorance. They were the product of a system, one that connected households, streets, water, trade, and population into a single, evolving environment. A system that, for all its resilience, was beginning to show signs of strain. And as that strain became more visible, more tangible in the air people breathed each day, it would begin to push communities toward responses that went beyond routine adjustment. Responses that, while still limited, marked the early stages of a more deliberate attempt to understand and manage the conditions of everyday life. Because once the environment is seen as something that can be influenced, even slightly, it stops being entirely neutral. It begins to carry meaning. A heavy smell is no longer just unpleasant. It becomes a signal. A change in the air suggests that something has shifted, something that might need attention, or at least understanding. In many medieval communities, this interpretation of air took on a kind of quiet importance. People did not possess the scientific language we use today, but they developed a vocabulary of experience. Air could be described as thick or light, clean or corrupt, healthy or dangerous. These were not abstract ideas. They were grounded in daily observation, what people felt when they entered a space, how they reacted to certain conditions, what seemed to precede illness or discomfort. Within the home, this awareness shaped small but meaningful decisions. A room that consistently felt heavy might be avoided when possible or used differently. A sleeping area might be moved, even slightly, to a position where the air seemed to circulate better. Windows and doors, when opened, were not simply letting in light. They were introducing a different quality of air, one that could change how the entire space felt. There is something almost intuitive in this. Without formal theory, people learned to read their environment through the senses available to them. Smell, in particular, became a guide. It did not always provide accurate information, but it was immediate, unavoidable, and deeply tied to the experience of living within a space. This sensitivity extended beyond the household into the wider community. Certain areas became known, not just for their function, but for their atmosphere. A street near a particular trade might be associated with a specific smell. A section of town near stagnant water might carry a reputation for being unpleasant or even unhealthy. These associations influenced movement, behavior, and, over time, even patterns of settlement. And yet, there is a complexity here that resists simple explanation. Not all strong smells were feared, and not all mild ones were trusted. The environment was too varied, too layered for such clear distinctions. Instead, people navigated a spectrum of experience, making judgments based on context, familiarity, and observation. This is where the medieval understanding of air intersects with something more cultural. Beliefs about health, morality, and environment were often intertwined. Certain smells might be associated with decay, impurity, or disorder, while others might be linked to cleanliness, vitality, or even spiritual well-being. These associations did not always align with what we would consider accurate today, but they shaped how people responded to their surroundings. For example, the use of fragrance, herbs, flowers, incense was not only about improving comfort. It was also about influencing the perceived quality of the air. A room filled with a pleasant scent could feel safer, more ordered, more controlled, even if the underlying conditions had not changed significantly. In this way, scent became both a practical tool and a symbolic one, bridging the gap between physical environment and human perception. At the same time, there remained a constant negotiation between what could be sensed and what could be known. A foul smell might indicate a problem, but not all problems produced a smell. Illness could spread in ways that were not immediately detectable through the senses. This gap between perception and reality added another layer of uncertainty to medieval life, one that could not be easily resolved. And yet, despite this uncertainty, people continued to act. They cleaned, aired, rearranged, and adapted, not because they had complete understanding, but because they had experience. Over time, this experience formed a kind of practical knowledge, one that guided behavior even in the absence of formal explanation. As towns grew larger and more complex, this practical knowledge began to intersect with broader efforts at organization. Rules about waste disposal, street maintenance, and the placement of certain trades were not only responses to visible problems. They were also attempts to manage the invisible qualities of the environment, the air, the smell, the atmosphere that connected one space to another. These efforts were often uneven, shaped by local conditions and limited resources, but they reflect a growing recognition that the environment could not be left entirely to chance. It required attention, coordination, and, at times, intervention. Within the home, these broader changes filtered down in subtle ways. A household might adjust its routines in response to new expectations or regulations. Waste might be handled differently not only for practical reasons but because of shifting norms. The placement of certain activities within the home might change, influenced by a growing awareness of how they affected the surrounding air. Even small changes could have noticeable effects. Moving a storage area, adjusting the position of a hearth, or altering how waste was temporarily contained could shift the balance of smells within a room. These adjustments did not eliminate the underlying conditions, but they demonstrate an ongoing effort to shape them. And as these efforts accumulated, they began to alter the experience of domestic life in gradual but meaningful ways. The medieval home remained a place of overlapping functions, of limited separation, of constant negotiation. But within that structure, there was a growing sense that the environment could be influenced, that discomfort could be reduced, that certain conditions could be improved. This sense of possibility, even if limited, is what distinguishes the later medieval period from what came before. It is not that the problems disappeared, but that the response to them became more deliberate, more informed by observation and experience. At the same time, the pressures driving these changes did not diminish. If anything, they continued to intensify. Population growth, economic expansion, and the increasing complexity of urban life all contributed to an environment that was more demanding, more interconnected, and more difficult to manage. And within this environment, the medieval home continued to function as both a refuge and a point of exposure. It offered shelter, warmth, and familiarity, but it also remained open, physically and sensorially, to the conditions of the world beyond its walls. The air inside was never entirely separate from the air outside. The smells that filled the home were shaped by what happened in the street, in the market, in the surrounding landscape. And as these external influences grew stronger, they pressed more firmly into the domestic space, shaping not only how people lived, but how they understood the world around them. And it is here, in this growing awareness of connection and consequence, that the story begins to move toward a new phase, one in which the management of environment would become not just a matter of habit or preference, but an increasingly urgent concern, driven by forces that would challenge communities in ways they had not yet fully experienced. Because there comes a point in any system under strain when the ordinary patterns of discomfort begin to feel different, not simply heavier or more persistent, but more uncertain. When familiar smells, those layered combinations of smoke, dampness, animals, and daily life, start to blend with something less predictable, something that does not behave in the same way. In medieval towns, this often revealed itself not through a single dramatic change, but through subtle disturbances in routine. A street that had always smelled unpleasant might begin to feel unusually oppressive. A room that had always been manageable might seem harder to tolerate. The difference was not always easy to define, but it was felt. And when such changes appeared alongside patterns of illness, they took on a new kind of significance. It is important to understand that for medieval people, the connection between smell and health was not a casual assumption. It was one of the primary ways they made sense of disease. The idea that bad air could carry harm was not simply superstition. It was an attempt to explain observable patterns. Illness often seemed to arise in places where the air was stagnant, where waste accumulated, where conditions felt most oppressive. The conclusion, even if incomplete, followed naturally, that something in the air itself was responsible. This belief shaped how people responded when conditions worsened. Efforts to improve the air became more urgent, more deliberate. Windows and doors were opened more frequently when possible, despite the risks of cold or intrusion. Fires might be used not just for warmth or cooking, but to alter the quality of the air. Aromatic substances, herbs, resins, incense, were burned or placed within rooms in the hope of counteracting what was perceived as dangerous. These practices did not eliminate the underlying causes of illness, but they reveal something important about how people understood their environment. The air was not empty. It was active, capable of carrying both comfort and harm. And because it moved, because it connected spaces, it became a focus of attention in moments of uncertainty. Within the home, this awareness could change behavior in subtle ways. A household experiencing illness might rearrange its space, moving the sick away from certain areas, increasing efforts to ventilate rooms, altering routines in an attempt to restore balance. These actions were guided by observation, by what seemed to help or at least not worsen the situation. At the same time, the limits of these responses were becoming more apparent. When illness spread beyond a single household, affecting neighbors, streets, or entire sections of a town, the problem could no longer be managed within the confines of one home. The shared nature of the environment, the same air, the same water, the same crowded spaces, meant that what happened in one place could influence many others. This is where the earlier shift toward shared responsibility began to take on greater weight. Efforts to manage waste, to clear streets, to regulate certain activities were no longer just about comfort or order. They became, at least in part, about protection. Not in a fully understood scientific sense, but in a practical one, an attempt to reduce the conditions that seemed to be associated with illness. And yet, even as these efforts intensified, they often struggled to keep pace with the scale of the problem. Towns were growing faster than their systems could adapt. Infrastructure, such as it was, remained limited. The same patterns of accumulation and dispersal continued, even as people tried to manage them more actively. Within this tension, the medieval home took on an even more complex role. It remained a place of shelter, of family, of daily life. But it also became, in certain moments, a place of concern, a space where the condition of the air, the presence of certain smells, and the arrangement of the environment could feel directly connected to well-being. This did not transform the home into a place of constant anxiety. Daily life continued, routines persisted, and much of what had always been accepted remained so. But alongside this continuity, there was a growing layer of awareness, a sense that the environment mattered in ways that were not always visible but could be felt. There is a kind of quiet shift here from familiarity to vigilance. Not a dramatic change, but a gradual adjustment in how people related to their surroundings. The same smells that had once been simply part of life now carried additional meaning. They were not only signs of daily activity, but potential indicators of something more. This shift also influenced how people thought about space beyond their immediate surroundings. The idea that certain areas might be healthier than others, that some environments were safer or more dangerous, began to take on greater importance. Movement within the town, choice of residence, even patterns of work could be influenced by these perceptions. And still, the ability to act on these perceptions remained limited. Most people could not simply relocate or dramatically alter their living conditions. They worked within the spaces available to them, adjusting what they could, enduring what they could not change. But even within these limits, the accumulation of experience continued to shape behavior. Practices that seemed to reduce discomfort or illness, even slightly, were repeated. Those that did not were gradually abandoned. Over time, this process of trial and observation contributed to a more refined, if still incomplete, understanding of the relationship between environment and health. At the same time, the broader system continued to evolve. Trade networks expanded further, bringing new goods and new pressures. Urban populations grew, increasing density and complexity. Climate variations, periods of scarcity, and other external factors added further strain. All of these influences fed into the same shared environment, the same air that moved between street and home, carrying with it the traces of everything that happened within the community. And as this environment became more complex, more interconnected, and at times more unpredictable, it began to challenge not only the practical routines of daily life, but the assumptions that underpinned them. The medieval home, once understood primarily as a place to endure and adapt, was now part of a larger, more uncertain system, one in which the air itself could no longer be taken for granted, and where the consequences of that uncertainty were beginning to make themselves felt in ways that would soon demand even more attention. And it is at this point, as awareness deepens and pressure continues to build, that the story begins to edge closer to moments where the familiar patterns of medieval life, its homes, its streets, its shared atmosphere, would be tested in ways that would leave a lasting mark on how people understood the spaces they lived in. Because when familiar patterns no longer behave as expected, when the same streets, the same homes, the same routines seem to produce different outcomes, people begin to question what they once accepted without hesitation. And in the medieval world, those questions often returned, again and again, to the air itself. There are periods in history where change is visible in architecture, in clothing, in written records. But there are also periods where change is felt more than seen. The medieval experience of smell, of atmosphere, belongs partly to that second kind. It is not always marked by clear milestones, but by a growing unease with conditions that had once been tolerable. In some towns, this unease showed itself in small but telling behaviors. People might begin to avoid certain enclosed spaces more deliberately, lingering outdoors when possible, even when the outside environment was far from ideal. Certain rooms within a house might fall out of regular use, not because they were structurally unsound, but because they felt wrong, too heavy, too stale, too difficult to remain in for long. This sense of wrongness is difficult to define in modern terms, but it would have been familiar to those living within it. It was not simply the presence of smell, but a change in its character. The difference between what was known and what felt unfamiliar, even if only slightly so. And when these sensations appeared alongside illness, when households or neighborhoods experienced patterns that did not align with previous expectations, the connection between environment and health became more than theoretical. It became experiential. Within the home, this could lead to a quiet reordering of priorities. Comfort, once measured primarily in warmth, shelter, and proximity to essential resources, began to include something less tangible: the quality of the air itself. A room that allowed for better circulation, even if it was less convenient in other ways, might be preferred. A sleeping space that felt lighter might be chosen over one that was warmer but more enclosed. These choices did not always make logical sense by modern standards, but they reflect a growing sensitivity to conditions that could not be easily explained or controlled. People were responding to what they felt, using the information available to them, even when it was incomplete. At the same time, communal responses began to take on a slightly different tone. Earlier efforts to manage waste and maintain streets had been driven largely by practicality and comfort. Now, in certain contexts, they carried an added urgency. The idea that the environment could contribute to illness made these tasks more significant, even if the exact mechanisms remained unclear. Regulations, where they existed, might be enforced with a bit more seriousness. Activities that produced particularly strong or persistent smells could become points of contention, not just for their inconvenience, but for their perceived impact on health. The placement of certain trades, the handling of waste, the maintenance of shared spaces, all of these began to intersect more directly with concerns about well-being. And yet, despite this growing attention, the fundamental limitations remained unchanged. The medieval world did not possess the tools to fully separate clean from unclean, fresh from stale, safe from unsafe. It operated within a system where these boundaries were constantly blurred, where improvement was incremental and often fragile. This fragility is perhaps the most important aspect to understand. The balance that households and communities had been maintaining through routine, adaptation, and gradual adjustment could be disrupted more easily than it could be restored. A period of unusual weather, a sudden increase in population, a disruption in trade or labor, all of these could shift conditions in ways that made the environment more difficult to manage. And when that happened, the sensory experience of daily life changed. The air felt different. Smells became more noticeable, more intrusive, more difficult to ignore. The house, which had always been a place of negotiation between comfort and necessity, could begin to feel less stable, less predictable. It is in these moments that the medieval relationship with environment becomes most revealing. People did not retreat entirely from their surroundings, nor could they. They continued to live, to work, to adapt. But alongside this continuity, there was a growing recognition that the conditions they lived within were not fixed, that they could shift in ways that mattered deeply. This recognition did not lead to immediate solutions, but it did shape perception. The environment was no longer simply the backdrop to daily life. It became part of the story, something to be observed, interpreted, and, where possible, influenced. Within the home, this might mean greater attention to routine, more consistent efforts to clean, to air, to manage the small details that could make a difference. It might mean a heightened awareness of how activities were arranged, of how space was used, of how materials were handled. Outside the home, it might mean increased pressure on communal systems, however limited they were. The expectation that streets should be cleared, that waste should be managed, that certain practices should be controlled. These ideas gained strength, even if their implementation remained uneven. And through all of this, the air continued to move, carrying with it the traces of everything that happened within the community. It remained the most immediate, most inescapable connection between individual households and the wider environment. What changed gradually was not the air itself, but how it was understood. It was no longer just something to be endured or improved in small ways. It was something that could signal deeper problems, something that could influence outcomes that mattered far beyond comfort. And as this understanding deepened, even without the language or tools to fully explain it, it began to push medieval communities toward a more active engagement with their environment. An engagement that would continue to evolve as pressures mounted, and as the limits of existing practices became increasingly difficult to ignore. And it is from within this growing tension, between awareness and limitation, between effort and outcome, that the next developments begin to emerge as people, still grounded in their daily routines, found themselves facing conditions that would test not only their homes and their streets, but their understanding of the very air they depended on. Because when a system begins to strain, it does not only reveal its weaknesses. It also reveals its patterns more clearly. In medieval towns, this meant that the connection between place and experience became more sharply defined. Certain areas were no longer just inconvenient or unpleasant. They developed a kind of reputation not formalized but widely understood. A narrow street where waste lingered too long, a corner near a poorly drained ditch, a cluster of houses where the air seemed consistently heavy. These places became known in ways that shaped how people moved through them. This did not mean they were abandoned. Most people had little choice in where they lived or worked. But within those constraints, even small decisions began to matter. A person might choose a slightly longer route to avoid a particularly oppressive passage. A household might adjust its habits to reduce how often it interacted with certain shared spaces. These were not dramatic acts of control, but they reflect a growing attentiveness to the environment as something uneven, something that varied from place to place. Inside the home, this unevenness became more noticeable as well. Not all corners of a house were the same. One part might remain damp longer than another. One section might collect smoke more heavily. A space near the door might feel fresher at certain times of day, while an interior corner might hold onto stale air. Over time, people learned these differences intimately. A house was not a single environment, but a series of small micro-environments, each with its own character. And by moving within these spaces, shifting where they sat, slept, or worked, people could influence their experience, even if they could not change the house itself. This kind of internal navigation is easy to overlook, but it would have been a quiet part of daily life. A bench placed slightly closer to a draft. Bedding arranged where air moved more freely. Tools stored where dampness was less likely to settle. These adjustments did not eliminate smell, but they shaped how it was encountered. There is also a growing sense, in this period, that not all accumulation is equal. Some smells were tolerated because they were expected: smoke from the hearth, the presence of animals, the residue of cooking. Others began to stand out more sharply, particularly those associated with stagnation or decay. The difference between what was considered normal and what was considered excessive became more defined, even if it remained subjective. This distinction influenced effort. Households might accept a certain level of discomfort as part of life, but they would act more quickly when that threshold was crossed. A spill left too long, waste not removed in time, a buildup in a corner that began to rot. These were not ignored entirely. They were addressed when possible because they felt different, more intrusive. At the level of the town, similar distinctions began to shape collective behavior. Not every street could be kept clear, not every space could be maintained, but certain areas, those most heavily used, most visible, or most problematic, might receive more attention. The idea of prioritization, of focusing effort where it mattered most, began to take form, even if it was not always formally organized. And yet, Despite this growing awareness, the environment continued to resist full control. Weather, in particular, played a powerful role. Rain could both cleanse and complicate, washing away some accumulation while spreading others into new areas. Heat could intensify smells, accelerating decay and making conditions more difficult. Cold could preserve certain materials, delaying their breakdown but also trapping them in place. These cycles meant that the experience of smell was never entirely stable. It changed with the season, with the weather, with the flow of daily activity. A place that felt tolerable in one context could become oppressive in another. This variability required constant adjustment, a willingness to respond rather than rely on fixed solutions. Within this shifting environment, one of the most revealing aspects is how people balanced proximity and distance. Medieval life required closeness to family, to work, to resources, but it also created a desire, however limited, for moments of separation. A brief step outside, a short walk beyond the densest part of town, a moment near open land or moving water. These experiences offered a contrast that would have been deeply felt. They did not represent an escape in the modern sense, but they provided perspective. The difference between enclosed and open air, between dense and dispersed smell, between constant presence and temporary relief. These contrasts shaped how people understood their environment. And as these contrasts became more familiar, they began to influence how space was valued. Access to slightly fresher air, to better drainage, to more open surroundings could become a subtle advantage. Not always decisive, not always attainable, but noticeable. At the same time, the pressures driving density did not diminish. Economic opportunity, trade, and the structure of medieval society continued to draw people into towns, into close proximity with one another. The same forces that made urban life possible also made it more difficult to manage at the level of air and environment. This creates a kind of tension that runs quietly through the medieval experience. The need to be close and the desire, however faint, to be less so. The necessity of shared space and the challenges that sharing brings. And within this tension, the home remained both a solution and a problem. It offered a degree of control, a space where routines could be established and maintained. But it also remained open to the wider environment, influenced by what happened beyond its walls. The smells that filled a medieval home, then, were not isolated phenomena. They were part of a larger system, one that connected individual experience to collective conditions. A change in the street could be felt in the house. A shift in weather could alter both at once. A pattern of activity in one area could influence many others. As this interconnected system grew more complex, it became harder to ignore its effects. The air itself, once simply a background condition, had become a central part of how people experienced their world. And as awareness of this continued to deepen, even without the tools to fully understand or control it, it began to shape not only daily behavior, but the questions people asked, questions about cause, about connection, about what could be changed and what had to be endured. Questions that would not be answered immediately, but that would continue to guide attention and effort as medieval communities moved forward, carrying with them both the limitations of their time and the beginnings of a more deliberate engagement with the environments they lived in. Because once you begin to ask why something feels the way it does, why a room becomes heavy, why a street seems oppressive, why certain places are avoided, you start to notice patterns that were always there, but not always acknowledged. In medieval homes, this often meant paying closer attention to how things changed over time, not just from day to day, but across longer stretches. A house that had been lived in for years did not simply remain the same. It aged, materials settled, darkened, absorbed. The air itself seemed to carry a memory of what had passed through it. This idea of accumulation becomes more important the longer you consider it. A newly built space, even with the same materials and design, would not have felt quite like one that had been occupied for decades. The first layers of smoke, the first cycles of dampness, the first traces of daily life would begin to settle in slowly, almost invisibly. Over time, these layers thickened, not always in ways that could be seen, but certainly in ways that could be sensed. People did not speak of this in modern terms, but they would have recognized the difference. A house that had been long inhabited might feel heavier, more settled, sometimes more difficult to keep fresh. It required more effort to maintain, more attention to prevent small issues from becoming larger ones. And this is where maintenance itself becomes part of the story, not as a single task, but as an ongoing relationship between people and their environment. Sweeping, clearing, airing, repairing. These were not occasional actions, but regular practices, repeated again and again in an effort to keep the balance from shifting too far. There is something almost rhythmic in this. A floor is cleared and slowly gathers debris again. A room is aired and gradually becomes enclosed once more. Waste is removed and begins to accumulate again. The work is never finished. It is only continued. This repetition can feel unremarkable, but it is central to understanding medieval life. The smell of the home was not a fixed condition. It was the result of this ongoing cycle, shaped by how consistently these tasks were performed, and by how much the environment pushed back against them. And the environment did push back, often in ways that were difficult to anticipate. A period of prolonged rain could introduce dampness that lingered far longer than usual. A shortage of fuel might reduce the use of fire, altering both warmth and the movement of air. A disruption in routine, caused by illness, travel, or labor demands, could allow small accumulations to grow into more noticeable problems. These moments reveal how delicate the balance could be. The difference between a tolerable environment and an oppressive one might rest on a handful of missed actions, or on conditions that lay just beyond individual control. At the same time, this fragility encouraged a kind of attentiveness that was both practical and intuitive. People learned to notice early signs, the faint shift in smell that suggested something was beginning to decay, the subtle heaviness in the air that indicated a need for ventilation, the dampness that hinted at deeper issues within the structure of the house. These signals did not always lead to immediate solutions, but they provided guidance. They helped people decide when to act and what to prioritize, even in a world where resources were limited and choices were constrained. Outside the home, similar patterns were unfolding. Streets, like houses, required constant maintenance. The difference was that responsibility was shared and often unevenly distributed. Some areas might be cared for more regularly, either because they were more visible or more heavily used. Others might be neglected, either through lack of resources or lack of coordination. This unevenness created a landscape of variation, where one part of a town could feel noticeably different from another. Not in a dramatic way, but in small, cumulative differences, the way the ground felt underfoot, the way the air moved, the persistence of certain smells. And because these differences were experienced daily, they became part of how people understood their environment. A person might not be able to articulate exactly why one street felt more tolerable than another, but they would know it through experience. This experiential knowledge is one of the most important elements of the medieval relationship with smell. It was not abstract or theoretical. It was immediate, grounded in the body's response to the environment. It shaped decisions in quiet ways, influencing where people lingered, where they avoided, how they arranged their spaces, and how they moved through their day. At the same time, it is important to recognize that this knowledge existed alongside a set of limitations that could not easily be overcome. No amount of attentiveness could fully separate the home from the wider environment. No amount of routine could prevent all accumulation. The system remained interconnected, and therefore resistant to complete control. This resistance is what gives the medieval experience its particular character. It is not a story of ignorance or neglect, but of continuous effort within a system that could only be partially shaped. And within that effort, there is also a kind of resilience. People did not simply endure their environment. They worked with it, adjusted to it, found ways to make it livable, even when conditions were far from ideal. But resilience has its limits, and as pressures continued to build through population growth, economic change, and the increasing complexity of urban life, those limits began to approach. The small adjustments that had once been sufficient began to feel less effective. The balance that had been maintained through routine and attentiveness became harder to sustain. The environment, in subtle but persistent ways, began to feel less predictable. And it is at this point, when the familiar methods of adaptation begin to show their strain, that the medieval home, along with the streets and communities that surrounded it, moves closer to a threshold where gradual change alone would no longer be enough, and where the experience of living within that shared air would take on an even more significant and challenging dimension. And where the experience of living within that shared air would take on an even more significant and challenging dimension, the story of the medieval home begins, at last, to reveal what it was always quietly pointing toward. Because for all the discomfort, for all the heaviness, for all the layers of smoke, dampness, waste, and human closeness, these homes were not simply unpleasant places. They were necessary ones. They were built, maintained, and lived in under conditions that demanded constant compromise. And that is perhaps the most important truth to carry forward. The medieval home smelled the way it did not because people failed to care, but because they were living at the edge of what was materially possible for their time. Every smell we followed, smoke embedded in beams, dampness in floors, animals in shared space, food lingering in the air, waste waiting to be moved, each of these was tied to something essential: heat, food, survival, protection. To remove one entirely would have meant losing something else. And yet, within those limits, people still tried. They aired rooms when they could. They swept, replaced, burned herbs, moved objects, adjusted habits. They paid attention. They noticed what worked, even slightly. They built small improvements into daily routine, not expecting perfection, but aiming for balance. Over generations, those small efforts mattered. They did not transform medieval homes into clean, scentless environments, but they slowly changed expectations. They introduced the idea, quiet at first, then more widely felt, that living space could be shaped, that air could be improved, that discomfort could be reduced, even if not eliminated. And from that idea, something larger began to grow. Not all at once, not in a single invention or moment, but gradually as building methods improved, as towns reorganized, as systems for waste and water became more deliberate, the medieval relationship with environment began to evolve into something more controlled, more separated, more managed. The long arc of that change would eventually lead to a world where the smells of daily survival were pushed further away, out of the home, out of sight, and often out of awareness. But in the medieval world, none of that separation yet existed. The home remained a place where everything met, where fire, food, body, animal, and waste coexisted in close quarters, where the air told the story of what had happened that day, and the day before, and the years before that. And perhaps that is why, when we imagine these spaces now, it is not just the smell that stands out. It is the closeness, the intimacy with the realities of life that modern systems have learned to hide. To step into a medieval home would not simply be to notice something unpleasant. It would be to enter a world where nothing was distant, where every part of living, comfort and discomfort alike, remained within reach of the senses. And once you begin to see it that way, the smell is no longer just a detail. It becomes a reminder of how people lived, how they adapted, and how much of what we now take for granted, clean air, separated spaces, controlled environments, was not the starting point of human life, but the result of centuries of slow, careful change. And even then, those changes never fully removed the need for attention, for maintenance, for awareness. They simply shifted where that effort took place. So the next time the idea of a medieval home comes to mind, it may feel less like a distant curiosity and more like a window into a different balance. One where life was closer, heavier, and more immediate, but also deeply shaped by the same instinct we still carry today. The instinct to make a place livable. And if you've made it this far, I'd be genuinely curious. What part of medieval daily life feels hardest to imagine living with? And if you enjoy these calm, deeper explorations into the past, you can always subscribe to hear more stories like this, told slowly and as honestly as we can manage.